result each year. Around 80% of all antibiotics sold in the United States are used for livestock, not humans, according to the National Institutes of Health. When I first started my career, I studied the growth of factory farming systems across the globe. I went to massive chicken farms in parts of Asia, visited livestock operations in Latin America, and have been to more slaughterhouses and processing plants than I care to remember. And while mixed livestock crop systems are essential for organic and sustainable agriculture systems, factory farming operations are leading to disastrous environmental, social, and health consequences. One of the reasons that there is misuse and overuse of antibiotics in animal agriculture is that animals are often raised in abhorrent conditions. They're crowded together, sometimes in the thousands, and modern breeding practices that focus on growth at all costs have left them with weakened skeletal and immune systems. They are often given antibiotics prophylactically, that is without disease, to make sure that they can survive until slaughter. The problem is that when you feed animals low levels of antibiotics each day, it creates the perfect environment to breed new bacteria, which cannot be tamed by antibiotics. Those resistant bacteria are transmitted to humans in several ways. Most often, it's through the direct contact with animals, exposure to the manure, or contact with raw meat. But antibiotic resistance can also spread through the consumption of undercooked meat. Once these bacteria spread to humans and make them sick, doctors have few ways to help them. But while antibiotic resistance is a real threat, there are thankfully ways to solve this problem. Over the next hour, we'll be hearing from scientists and experts, as well as farmers and producers and a chef who are working to combat antibiotic resistance and ensure that we don't face yet another extreme public health crisis. To help lead the discussions today, we have nationally renowned journalist Jane Black. Jane covers food politics, trends, and sustainability. Her work appears regularly in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. She'll be moderating two panels, one on the causes of antibiotic resistance and the second on solutions. Before I turn to Jane, however, I'm really excited to have a discussion with John Gingo, the president of Applegate Farms. For over 30 years, the company has been producing organic pasture-raised meat and cheese products free of GMO ingredients and sourcing from farms where animals are treated with care and respect and are allowed to grow at their natural rate and perform all their natural behaviors. In 2015, the company was acquired by Hormel. John, I want to thank you so much for joining me and helping lead this important discussion today. And I'm hoping we can start with some context. A lot of folks watching might not know a lot about this issue of antibiotic resistance and really that misuse and overuse of antibiotics. It's such a huge issue and it's really happening around the globe. And I'm wondering if you can share your perspective.
Thank you, Danny. And that was a great opening, setting the stage. I will say from my point of view, in terms of the context, so many of us are so deep on this issue. But if you take a step back and just really think about the basic principle here, which is we have antibiotics available to us. It's sort of like a super drug, a precious resource that is accessible, affordable, cures all types of infections. You go back and think strep throat used to be deadly, and ear infection can kill. We have these antibiotics, which are so wonderful, and yet we're indiscriminately using them in a way where it jeopardizes their effectiveness just to save, I'll call it, a few pennies per pound on meat. So it reminds me of one of the things our founder at Applegate, Stephen McDonald, used to say, which was, can you imagine coming down for breakfast and sprinkling some antibiotics on the cereal of your children every day just to make sure they don't get sick? You would never do that, but yet that's what we're doing with our animals. And it's creating this risk with really deadly consequences. Now, that's the context, and it's sort of easy to say, well, stop using them. The difference is it's not completely simple to just stop, because right. It's the system that's sick, not the animals. So I guess what I'm saying is we're using antibiotics to treat a sick system and not sick animals. When I say a sick system, I mean, to your earlier point, one without sufficient space for the animals, sure. One without healthy and proper conditions for the animals. And so we're using antibiotics as sort of a cure-all for potential coming out of that sick system. And so I guess I'm just really happy to get this back on the radar and get this discussion going today.
Absolutely. I think nothing's more important, especially as we're coming out of the pandemic and realizing that sort of this second pandemic has been happening for years and years of antibiotic resistance. And, I appreciate what you said about the system being sick. And, this is not an easy issue to solve. So, from what you're seeing and doing as a business leader, are we at a point of no return, or can we do something now to make this the moment, the year, the decade where we can really turn this around?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I do think while we've seen some troubling signs in the trends, I in no way have lost hope. So I do believe that we can turn the tide and actually get back ahead of this. I have three reasons why I believe we can turn the tide. The first is consumers. I'm a big believer in consumer choice. And if you look at what's happening with consumers, I would say more and more consumers are waking up to our food system, the fragility of our food system, understanding. They want to understand more about our food system, where their food is coming from, especially true with younger consumers, which is even more hope, but consumers broadly. So I think that education of consumers who want to learn is one reason why I have belief. Second is industry. So I do believe in the power of industry and companies to drive change. And I guess I'm fortunate to work for a company that has a track record of driving some of that change. When Applegate first got into the meat raised without antibiotics movement, it was virtually non-existent. Today, it's over a $3 billion category, growing pretty quickly. That is one sign. We also had a handful of farms in the beginning. We now work with over 4,000 farmers who are producing without antibiotics. And we've also seen great progress in the poultry industry with some of the larger companies in terms of removal of antibiotics. So I believe in that power of industry as the second hope. And the third piece is, on top of that, I think, government gives me hope that the government can help us here drive some change. And I mean that from the standpoint of not necessarily even limit to regulations, but even just bringing more transparency to reporting, tracking the flow and usage of antibiotics. I think just having that transparency and visibility is so important. And if we look at some of the examples in Europe, whether it's Denmark or Netherlands, a lot of the success in Europe in terms of reducing reliance on antibiotics started with data and transparency. So I have a lot of hope that we can actually turn the tide, but it's going to be consumer choice, it's going to be industry, and hopefully it will be government as well coming together.
Yeah, it really takes them all working together. Consumers, industry, government. I like that point about transparency, and we absolutely need more data on these issues. We need companies reporting. We need them to have a greater role than they've had before. And I also appreciate what you said about the role of especially younger consumers who are more interested in the story of their food and being able to track where their food comes from and have an interest in who produced it, how that meat was produced, and how it ends up on their plate. Those are all fantastic ways to help solve this problem in creative ways. And it's not just one entity that can be part of the solution. I've told you, John, that I talk to a lot of food companies, probably more than necessary, but one word I hear over and over again from them is disrupt or disruption. And how is this an issue that companies can take a really active role in disrupting?
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think disruption is the way to think about it as opposed to incrementally. Disruption to me, if I think about disruptive examples, there's usually two sides to it. One is the moment and one is the disruptive act. Mm-hmm. And if I think about the moment in time where we are right now, beginning to emerge from this global pandemic, which was I call it a collective human health crisis, mm-hmm. right? So it had individual impacts, but we were all in it together. I couldn't imagine a better moment to tackle this issue, which is potentially, our next emerging global human health crisis. It already is, and it could at any moment escalate to something much bigger. So I do feel like the moment from that standpoint around us coming together as a global community to tackle a collective human health crisis, it's the right moment. On top of that, we're also coming through the pandemic and saying, we have to get back to some of the business at hand in terms of our planet.
Right.
How do we keep our water clean? How do we keep our soil healthy? How do we keep our air clean? And how do we keep our climate stable and improving? And so when you put all those pieces together, it's a great moment. Now, how do we actually disrupt? To me, the question is, how do we just stop using antibiotics quickly? The question is, how do we go for more holistic farming practices? Because that's really at the root of what we need to do, which is get to better ways of farming. And those better ways of farming, in total, will be disruptive. I mean, that's a major change in practice. And we're going to hear, I think, from some farmers later on. It's not an easy change, but it is a major holistic change. And it'll get us to practices that actually won't just remove antibiotics and help address that issue, but will also get us back to animals being outdoors, raised in more humane, better, more natural conditions. It'll get us to healthier soil with animal impact on land. It'll get us to healthier water, healthier air, more regenerative systems, more organic-based systems. These are the types of holistic systems that will actually disrupt the way we do things, and the impact will be broad beyond antibiotics. So that's why I do see a pathway to disruption, because I think the convergence of human health, of concern for our planet's health, bring us back to a point where we need to disrupt our practice on the farm.
Absolutely. And I couldn't agree with you more that the urgency of all of the issues you described is so great. And attacking the issue of antibiotic resistance, this is actually the moment to do it. And we can't miss this opportunity. John, my final question for you, maybe if you can take about 30 seconds to answer is, what advice do you have for consumers? They have a lot to grapple with when they're at the grocery store, at the farmer's market, or at their big box store. What advice do you give them about how to choose better meat products?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we hear from consumers, we talk to consumers all the time, and consumers are all different degrees of depth on their food journey. Let's say some, at the surface and some very deep. My advice to consumers would be dig a little bit deeper. If you dig a little bit deeper and learn a little bit more about where your food is coming from, how it's produced, the impacts of that system, if you dig a little bit deeper, you can make a lot better choices, right? So that little bit of digging will actually help you make much more informed choices that are better for you, for your family, for your kitchen table, but also for the planet and the animals in the system. So dig a little bit deeper and there'll be a lot of benefit.
That's great advice, John. Thank you so much. I think this is such a wonderful lead into the panels we'll be having. I'm now pleased to turn to Jane Black and our experts, including Ramanan Lakshmarian from the Center for Disease Dynamics, Economics, and Policy, Lance Price from George Washington University's Milken Institute School of Public Health, and Rod Martison from A-Frame Acres, who works with Nyman Ranch. So thanks to all of you for joining, and over to you, Jane.
Thank you so very much. I'm going to dive right in. I know Danny did a great job sort of setting the stage. And I also know that we have a pretty smart and engaged audience here, but I do want to just start at a very high level with Lance to just be very clear. Why are these antibiotics being used? Because it's sort of mind-blowing. And why are they so dangerous? So just set the stage for us.
Sure. I mean, this was the previous speakers were great setting this up, the value of antibiotics, but I'll just start with a basic definition, which these are medicines that kill bacteria. So they can be used to treat infections in people, and they specifically kill these infections without hurting us. The problem is that they have this inherent flaw, which is the more we use them, the more bacteria become resistant to their effects. And so that's how these superbugs emerge. And so whenever we use them, we potentially fuel the growth, fuel the evolution of drug-resistant bacteria. Well, we overuse them in human medicine, it's clear, and people are trying to expedite patient visits by just writing prescriptions. But in animal production, we're doing something even worse, which is to use them as sort of cheap production tools, as we heard, to sort of prop up broken systems that make animals sick. And so when you treat tens of thousands of birds in a house that are crammed together, or thousands of pigs that are standing around on each other's feces, crammed in snout to tail, they share microbes. And when you give them low doses of antibiotics, they're sharing drug-resistant microbes. And then those microbes can spread to us, farmers who handle the animals, people who are exposed to the waste through environmental exposure, but the consumers are probably at the greatest risk because we bring home these contaminated products that have these living, infectious, drug-resistant bacteria on them. And that's the real challenge. And so if you think about the pandemic, right? So why has the pandemic been such a challenge? Well, it's this new organisms none of us had seen before. We didn't have drugs to treat the infections, and this thing spreads from person to person very quickly. Well, that's the kind of microbes that we're creating in these animal production systems, and we're doing it around the world. And so, we invented this industrialized system that depends on antibiotics and fuels the growth of these drug-resistant bacteria. And then we've said, hey, world, look at what we're doing. And so we see developing countries embracing the same models.
Well, that is a perfect segue to our next speaker, who's Ramanan. I want to ask you, what is the situation globally? I'm curious who you think's in the rogues gallery of antibiotic overusers.
So thanks for inviting me, and thanks, Jane, for that question. So this idea of factory farming, actually, oddly enough, started in the United States. It started because of poultry being produced in large numbers through the use of antibiotics. And in fact, the entire post-war increase in production of meat, particularly poultry, but subsequently pork, was made possible by antibiotics. And let's be clear, there's some positives to having a lot more animal protein being produced, particularly for a population that doesn't have access to it. But one might argue that we've gone a little beyond what we really need to in terms of animal protein production. So the US has been in the lead in that sense. But other countries have followed suit, and everyone's using the same model. Remember that prior to the 1950s and 60s, poultry was, to have chicken was a rare thing. You'd have it one day a week. It's not something that people ate every day. And that was the situation with pork in China as recently as, say, 15 years ago, which is to have meat was a luxury. You had it maybe once a year, twice a year. But certainly if people, could have it every week or every day, then they would love to have it every week, every day. But that comes at a significant cost. Now, globally, pigs in China are the single largest consumers of antibiotics. In fact, consumption of antibiotics in China in the animal sector is larger than that of any other use of antibiotics anywhere else on the planet.
Wow.
Certainly more than humans in China. And in fact, the use in animals in China exceeds that of all of the rest of the world, put together. So that's as large as it is. But it's not surprising given that, China consumes a lot of the world's pork. And in fact, pork production has gone up about 6 times between 1975 and 2014 in that period of time. And also, production of pork, in China is vastly greater today than anywhere else. It's not just imported stuff, it's what's produced domestically.
Right.
Now, other countries are following suit because what we're witness to is the largest scale up in both the demand and, well, demand is one side, but really on the production of animal protein at any time in human history. We've never had a big scale up like this of this scale, which means that people in India want to have more meat on their table, people in Africa want to have more meat on their table, and all of that can only be made possible in systems that don't have the nutrition or the animal hygiene or the veterinary support or the feeders or the starter stock. If you don't have all of those things, then you depend on antibiotics to compensate for the lack of all of those specific inputs.
Right.
In a system that's optimized for hygiene, for biosecurity, for nutrition, for herd health, for veterinary support, for vaccination, you don't need the antibiotics. But if you have any of these missing, then you need the antibiotics.
Right.
And since systems in these places, don't necessarily have those inputs, we have a massive increase in antibiotic consumption in animals already over the last decade or two, but it's nothing compared to what we're about to see over the next couple of decades.
Right. And I am going to get to Ron next. I'm just going to go back to Lance for one more moment because I'm trying to stay focused on the problem as much as I'm yearning to jump to solutions. But Lance, so that's pretty scary that it's scaling up and we haven't even begun to see the scale up globally. Can you just set the stage for us a little bit in terms of where we are in the United States? My sense is that things are getting better, but definitely not fast enough. So what's the situation here?
Well, yeah, so things have gotten better. We've had from 2 fronts. So the FDA, through the Center of Veterinary Medicine, has made slow incremental changes over the years, sort of limiting the use of some of the most important antibiotics. But even with all of their progress, they've left open this giant loophole for routine disease prevention. So, they consider that a justified therapeutic, which is, treating diseases that are being caused because of the way we're raising the animals, production diseases. And so this is a gaping loophole that allows, tens of millions of pounds of antibiotics to be used every year. But the place where there's been the most rapid change response is to consumer advocacy. So informed consumers reaching out to the retailers, and then the big retailers going to the producers and saying, hey, give me chickens without antibiotics. I'm tired of, I don't know what the actual conversation is, but I'm tired of hearing these guys, give me chickens without antibiotics. And when we talk to them, they say that's what they're responding to. It's consumer demands. So you consumers who are listening, we're all consumers, right? We have the power. And so, so in chicken, we've made a lot of progress. We've gone from, 10 years ago, making less than 4% of the chickens without antibiotics, and today, almost all of them without antibiotics. But the places where we're continuing to fail are turkeys, pigs, and cattle. So we have great farmers like Ron, who you're going to hear from next, but most of those animals are being raised in these conventional concentrated animal feeding operations, perpetuating this ugly model that we're exporting to the world that's dependent on antibiotics.
Yeah, and Ron, I want to bring you in here. You do raise your pigs without antibiotics. And I'm curious, there's this sense that it's this impossible shift. How could we possibly do this work? You can't change the tires on the car while you're driving 60 miles an hour. What did you need to raise pigs without antibiotics? And what do you think other farmers need to make the switch? Tell us a little bit about your path.
Well, my path was a fairly simple one to make. That from a production standpoint, we sell about 1,000 pigs a year, and we decided that we really questioned why we needed to use antibiotics. Were we compensating for sloppy husbandry practices? Were we compensating for dirtier pens? Were we compensating for not keeping vaccinations up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And I decided at that time that there was more to my pig production than just getting that animal out the door, getting that product produced. I think getting back to your question, we need to educate, and we need to educate, and we need to educate. First and foremost, we need to make every sector of the conventional pork system see themselves without using antibiotics. We need to make them understand that it can be done, and we need to show them the ways that we can. I sell pigs into the Nyman Ranch system, and I feel very fortunate because we have a select series or group of individuals called field agents that their primary task is to help us, and by us I mean the Nyman Ranch farmers, as producers, raise the pigs without antibiotics. They are well versed in how it's done. They are well versed in what to do if problems arise, and they are well versed in how to help us develop strategies to avoid the need for antibiotics.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. Give me an example of that. I mean, we had spoken about sort of these transitions and how that's a big use time for antibiotics. Tell us about that, and tell us what you do differently, and maybe tell us how it wasn't really that hard to make that change.
Okay. Let's, in a typical system today, in a typical conventional system today, for instance, you will normally move pigs once you take them away from their mama. When you wean them, you will move them from that side and put them into another location. And anytime you do that, you're disrupting not only their lifestyle, their nutrient supply, et cetera, but they're also being exposed to a new group of bacteria or bugs in the place they're going to. And what the industry normally does is at that time, they will give them antibiotics to help compensate or offset any risk to that. Another time that they can run into a similar situation is when they are moved in from that nursery or that starter phase into the finishing operation. And that can be exact same stresses. I mean, they go to a different place, they go to a different nutritional plane and whatnot, and they are exposed to a new set of bugs. Now you add to that the fact that they are commingled with different people or with different pigs, and they are crammed into tighter and tighter and tighter spaces where the chance of nose to tail contact, like Lance was talking about, increases. You are going to get more and more need for some sort of a therapeutic way to offset any adverse effects to that. What I like to do and what we have done at Nyman Ranch is simple little things like we lengthen the lactation period, or the amount of time that the pig stays with his mom, So the stress of removing the pig is alleviated a little bit. Another thing we do, we are very, very, very big on preventive medicines. Okay. We vaccinate and vaccinate and vaccinate for diseases that they may run into. I mean, it's not uncommon in a conventional finishing system to know that at week 15, the pigs normally break with such and such a disease. So at week 13 through week 16, we will put some sort of antibiotic in to prevent that, you know, alleviate the symptoms when that disease gets there. Where in the 9-month system, our goal is to vaccinate that animal ahead of time to make sure that when week 15 or 16 gets here, he won't get that because he's already protected and covered.
So let me just put a fine point on it. I have never raised a pig, and my backyard
Oh, you
garden,
don't know what you're missing.
my backyard garden did not impress
missing.
anyone. But this does not sound like rocket science. Is this rocket science to make this change?
To some folks it is, but to some folks it's not. It depends on what your mindset is and how willing you are to shift your paradigms.
Okay. So coming back to Lance and Ramanan, then, you know, I was hoping that Ron would say it's not rocket science. And then I'd say, okay, if it's not rocket science, then why aren't we making progress? But it could be rocket science to some people. I'm going to accept that answer. But Lance and Ramanan, why aren't we making progress? Why can't we tell conventional pig farmers all over this country, there are different ways you can do this, and it's not going to, the end is not nigh? What do you see as these obstacles? Ramanan or Lance, whoever wants to go first. Lance.
So, I mean, I think it's that they're not being forced to, right? So, I mean, it's great that we have companies again like Nyman and others that are taking the lead on this, but you know, the companies see the dollar, right? And they can make a quicker buck, an easier buck by doing it the old model. And they also, you know, there's been this misinformation that's been disseminated for decades that there's no connection between antibiotic use in animals and antibiotic resistance in people. And so nobody wants to believe they're hurting anybody. And so I think there's this misinformation, and then the fact that nobody's holding their feet to the fire. We need to hold their feet to the fire, because this is one of those commons that we don't want to lose, right? You don't want to try to perform, you know, many of the life-saving procedures that we do today without antibiotics. Even something as simple as cesarean sections need antibiotics. And so we can't afford to lose these things.
Right. Ramanan, you, I believe you feel like lobbying, there's a pretty strong farm lobby. Tell us about how that's blocking progress for us.
You know, I remember 20 years ago, if you went to Capitol Hill and you talked about making these changes, which were in everyone's interest. And to be honest, the cost of actually switching over on a per pound basis was not that high. You're talking about, you know, a few pennies to a pound of meat. And of course, you know, the first thing I realized was that, you know, 49 out of 50 states in the US are farm states. And so none of those senators is going to touch this with a barge pole. They don't want to offend their farmers. And the second is, of course, that there's a perception that you're hurting people, that you're hurting people who are poor, people who can't afford to buy meat. Now, remember that this is a problem that we have with any kind of social change. You have that problem when you say, why is it we haven't switched to electric cars yet? We could have done this 15 years ago. Why are we all driving gas guzzlers? Why haven't we made the change to clean energy, you know, much more generally? Why haven't we, you know, why did it take the Clean Air Act to switch to a system where we didn't tolerate pollution? It is because in those equilibria, it is difficult for any one player, unless they are, you know, extremely far-sighted or, you know, they have a social mission to say, I'm going to do something differently and then the rest can follow. Typically, no one steps out ahead of the herd, you know, no pun intended. And it's a tough place to be. And because no one wants to step out, everyone stays in that same equilibrium. You get out of that equilibrium in one of two ways. One is that the government forces you to do something, which is you basically say, listen, I want a clean energy standard, or I have a fuel efficiency standard, or I have a standard for how much antibiotics you can use, which is what the FDA 213 guidance document did. Once it did that, and remember the FDA 213 guidance document was not even something which was punitive. It basically was a guidance document. It said, we'd like you to do this. And that was enough to, you know, sort of push everything the other way. An important thing that led to change was really during the last years of the Obama administration, where they adopted a pro-antibiotic effectiveness stance. What that meant was that in all federal purchasing in cafeterias in the military, that all else being equal, if you didn't use antibiotics in your meat, you actually were given preference.
Mhm.
And I remember going to I don't know, you can go to any government cafeteria, HHS or anywhere, and you suddenly see that you have a choice of you can get chicken with antibiotics or chicken without antibiotics. It's actually up there on the menu.
Wow.
And it's only when consumers realize that their meat actually has antibiotics that they say, oh, I want the one without antibiotics. To be honest, consumers don't really care or understand as much about drug resistance. That's not what's driving the change. If you think of Sweden more than 30 years ago took antibiotics out of animals. They did that because of a newspaper article which talked about how much farmers were using antibiotics in the meat that we're raising. And the Swedes said, wait a minute, I don't want antibiotics in the food that I'm eating. And that's really what led to the change. It was not about drug resistance. It was that they did not want antibiotics in the food that they were eating. And I think that when you make these triggers or these catalytic changes, it then leads to an entire cascade where a whole bunch of other things change. And it can come from government, it can come from other places, but you do need that trigger.
Okay, I'm going to cut you off there because we're going to solutions and you're going to be able to elaborate on that there. I want to close just really quickly with Ron and Lance about sort of the benefits of farming without antibiotics. I know, Lance, you have a great story about a farmer in Denmark, but Ron, I mean, how has the experience been farming without antibiotics versus what you see elsewhere?
From my standpoint, it's been incredibly rewarding because when you do it with antibiotics, you do away with the crutches you can use. I mean, you can't cram the animals in as tight a confined area. You have to do a better job of mitigating and removing manure and stuff like that. And you get to see these animals actually exhibit natural behaviors and behaviors that they were intended to use and to give. They enjoy life, and I enjoy the rewards of raising these animals that way.
All right, Lance, close us out with your great story, and then we're going to move to panel 2.
Well, I mean, I think the great part of it, as Ron said, is that you have to switch from a system that makes animals sick to a system that promotes their health and well-being. Otherwise, you need the antibiotics. And when I was traveling in Denmark, checking out pig farms to try to learn how they got rid of the antibiotics, and we were getting this tour by Kai, the pig farmer, and he steps into these pigs into this pen with these giant pigs, and one comes right up to him and rubs against his leg like a dog would, and he starts rubbing its ear, and it's kind of doing this low grunting noise, and he said, I love it, I'm a farmer again. And it was really touching because he said, it used to be dangerous in here. These animals were stressed out, they were aggressive. I feared, for my health when I stepped in here, and now I'm a farmer again. And I've never forgotten that.
Well, thank you to our first set of panelists. There you go. Danny's here.
Thanks, everyone. That was wonderful. I want to reiterate what Lance just said. We need a system that promotes animal health. That's so common sense. That makes, I think, a sense to everyone. Why would we have a system that makes animals sick? I want to thank Jane and all of the panelists. I think this was a really deep overview in such a short amount of time. Now we have our second panel on solutions. Ramanan will be joining again on that panel. We also have Lena Brook from the Natural Resources Defense Council and Joel Gindo from Free Happy Farms. Over to you, Jane, again. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, jumping in because we're running a minute behind. Ramanan, you're up first because you're on video right now. Tell us just briefly what successes they've seen in Europe. It's, the developing world is sort of a different situation than Europe and the United States. We're sort of stuck where we are, as we just heard on the last panel, but what have they done in Europe?
Well, the US, the Europeans got a start primarily because of Sweden, and Sweden got that start because of the story I just told. They didn't want to have the antibiotics. But since then, the European Union has for a while now banned the use of medically important antibiotics for raising of meat for quite some years now. And it was something which was not an easy decision for them to get to. They had pushback from various member states, but they stuck with it because they were deeply concerned about resistance, and they were seeing fairly high levels of resistance, particularly in the Mediterranean countries. And there were instances where resistance was detected in animals first and then in humans, and therefore there was a concern that it was jumping from one place to the other. And there have been a number of studies looking at places like the Netherlands and Denmark. And what they found overall was that although overall antibiotics did decline, there was an uptick in the use of therapeutic antibiotics because you were dealing with sicker animals in some instances. And people looked at it and then said, wait a minute, so are we using more antibiotics for therapy? The answer is yes, until the point at which you improve animal health where you don't have to do that. Take Sweden, for instance. When they shut down their antibiotics in animals, 3% of Swedish farms, which are the least hygienic, the ones that had the most outdated practices, which are just not up to speed, they went out of business. But that was a good thing because those farms really should not have been operating anyway. And 97% of farms, changed their practices and survived. So without question, removing antibiotics from, this whole industry of raising animals will put some outdated, low-tech farmers out of business. But for the vast majority of them, I think it'll put them in a much better place. And but
they also, it's fair to say, they have vastly reduced the amount of antibiotics that they've used, and we've hardly seen the Danish pig industry collapse.
Absolutely, yeah, exactly. I think that goes without saying. They've done extremely well, and they've positioned themselves. Now to compete in Europe, you have to also raise, aquaculture or animals without antibiotics. So it does provide a significant competitive advantage to your domestic industry.
Right. So I want to move over to Lena. So we heard a little bit about how the governments decided to restrict the use. They sort of did what we have done here first. First, they said you can't use it for growth promotion, but they didn't necessarily say you can't use it for therapeutic. Then they changed that, and we saw the numbers come down. So you have a proposal with a group of a bunch of other advocacy groups to kind of do the same thing here. So tell us about your Antibiotics Off the Menu proposal for the Biden administration.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. So there's really kind of three main policy changes that NRDC and our allies, both in the Antibiotics Off the Menu Coalition and Antibiotics Working Coalition, are calling for with the Biden administration. The first is to close that loop that exists in Guideline 13, which Dr. Price had talked about a little bit earlier in the webinar. And really, this is a situation where the US did effectively ban the use of growth promotion for important antibiotics back in 2017. But unfortunately, they continue to allow a very similar use, essentially two sides of the same coin, which is that the same drugs at essentially the same doses are being used under the guise of root disease prevention. This needs to stop. I don't think we're going to get a handle on antibiotic until this happens. The other piece that's missing here is a national target for reduction. We do have something like that. The Obama administration had set a national reduction target for healthcare uses of antibiotics, but that didn't for livestock. And having a goal is always really helpful. And we'd like the Biden administration to reduce medically important antibiotic use by 50%. Relative to 2009 levels in the next 2 years. And we think this is really achievable based on what happened in the European Union. Finally, the third piece of this triangle is to develop a really robust tracking system. We heard Danny and others talk about the need for transparency, the need for data. This is a really secretive industry to stay that. And we're really looking toward the federal government to say no. Antibiotics are a public resource. This is really a tragedy of the commons that we're living in right now, and the course needs to be reversed, and the people kind of need to take back the power and say that it is really important to understand how these drugs are actually used in farms, to create reporting systems, to also understand what's happening with the development of antibiotic resistant bacteria on farms. Yeah. So those are the three pieces that we're looking for the Biden administration to act on.
Yeah, I hear you. And in my head, I'm thinking, yeah, it's so obvious. Why won't they do this? But at the same time, they kind of have a full plate. a lot going on for the Biden administration. Do you think that they will? Because when I've talked to people, advocates, there's less emphasis on the government than there is on the kind of things we heard at the beginning about companies taking actions, consumers taking action. So first, do you think they will take action? And second, is that the only way to achieve this?
Great. I don't have a crystal ball, and I do see that the Biden administration is obviously really committed to action on climate change, and they're also still dealing with the tail end of this massive global health pandemic that we've been facing with COVID. So there are these two massive urgent matters at their disposal right now. I hope that they can connect the dots actually between those two. Antibiotic resistance. There's given climate change, which is actually going to increase in the development of antibiotic resistant bacteria to thrive in hotter climates. And of course, we've seen the fallout of what a global health pandemic looks like. So that both of those situations should also give a sense of urgency and inspire action right now while we can really reverse course, right? It is not too late. And it's hard to say what they will do, but certainly one thing that we're looking toward is who the Biden administration will nominate as their FDA commissioner. I think that leadership role is an important signal as to what kind of a priority this will be.
I'm stopping you just for a second because you're cutting out a little bit. I'm going to let you mess around with it. I'm just going to go to Ramana, and then I promise I'm going to bring Joel in. Ramana, though, it's interesting. You have said to me that, the government is in many ways less important than it is in other countries, that here it's very consumer driven. Explain to me why and how the consumers and the corporations really have the potential to implement these solutions here.
Well, you heard from the last panel what Lance was saying that, and also, what has actually happened is that it's consumer preferences that have changed, and many of the groups that are on this call, the Keep Antibiotics Working Coalition, these folks have really helped bring about that change by first telling consumers, wait a minute, do you realize that the meat that you eat actually was raised using antibiotics? And I think building that awareness has really built a lot of that shift. I could not have imagined, again, 15 years ago or 10 years ago, that I'd see ads from Purdue or Tyson saying, we don't use antibiotics, period, ever. That was just not where they were with their thought process at all. And the fact that they switched so quickly into responding to consumer preferences was really because consumer preferences were shaped. And we've seen this again and again for things that are important in the environment, or, for a long time, people thought, but everybody needs ivory for piano keys. And there was never an outcry about ivory. But once there was a good substitute, then, killing elephants for ivory just became this terrible thing. We take that for granted today. But 30 years ago, that was not taken for granted at all. We were all messing with how in the world are we going to stop the world from using ivory? So I think these phase shifts can happen really quickly. And now is the time to do it. I think it is possible to have an economy of food which does not depend on antibiotics. That's an outdated system. It just has no place in today's world. And it certainly, the government can actually help, but I think everybody needs to pitch in. I think, fast food chains, if McDonald's and all of the leading fast food producers were to say, we're going to take a stand and we're going to take antibiotics out of any meat that we sell, in our restaurants, that would change things overnight.
Yeah. Well, McDonald's, I hope you're listening, because I'm crossing my fingers for that. And I think it is interesting and empowering, because sometimes these things, especially to me, we've all been stuck at home for the last year, thinking, what can I possibly do? And the fact that maybe we do hold the balance of power is really exciting. I want to bring Joel in because you are, you represent a new generation of farmers, young farmers, and you're not interested in farming with antibiotics. And I'm wondering if you can talk about that decision and whether you have that sense from your cohort of new farmers.
Well, yeah, for me, I'm not interested in using antibiotics in my pigs, so I also raise poultry too. And early on in the beginning, why I decided to do that, kind of like what Ron said, I asked myself question, why? I mean, if I'm not sick, then I don't think I'm gonna take a medicine. If I don't feel sick, then why do I need to give that to my livestock, pigs or chicken? And that's kind of the reason why I decided, well, I guess I don't need to do that. But with that, I had to do things different, like making sure the numbers of pigs I have in a particular place, or making sure, the management, how I raise pigs, making sure they have proper space, handling of deep beddings in their housing, they have access to go outside, all that I had to do things different. So as a beginning farmer, I guess as a young farmer, that was my initial thought. It's just the reason why do I need to do it if it's something that's not really necessary?
Yeah, because I think one of the things we heard from Ron in the previous panel was that, this is just kind of the way we do things, and people don't like other people, journalists sitting at home in their office saying everything you do is wrong. And I understand that that's obnoxious and we shouldn't be that way. But, in the conversations that you have in South Dakota and with other smaller livestock farmers, what is the sense? Is the sense like, of course I would never do this? Or is this a conversation that people are still having? Because I think it's interesting if there's this huge generational mindset that has changed.
Yeah, so I will talk about my experience, for example, at the farmer's market. So I sell some of my product at the farmer's market in Brookings and Sioux Falls. And I hear most of the time people start talking about antibiotics use in their meat. And what gives me hope, most people now really want to know how do I raise pigs, and whether I give them antibiotics or what kind of medication I put in the feed or anything like that. So I see a lot of that conversation at the farmer's market and of course at Nyman Ranch where I sell my pigs too.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I have a couple of friends that are getting into farming, and I'll say most of the younger people now, because of, as more people, I think they are more aware, they start to know where their food is coming from. Even the young people who are trying to get in, now they are trying to be more careful and finding other way on how can we do it. And for example, how are we going to do it different than how we did in the past?
Right.
Rather than having a building, they're thinking of using things like hope buildings, which, pigs have access to outside. They can have open doors, which create movement of air in the buildings. It's just, there's a lot of that talk. So customer ask more questions about, they ask me more questions about how kind of feed I put I feed pigs, how do they have access to the outdoor, whether I use antibiotics or not. And the young farmers too, they are looking for other ways like using hope.
I'm wondering if, and this is a question for Lena, I'm wondering if the questions, what he's talking about, this interest, I mean, certainly this building of where your food comes from has been building for a long time, but now we've just experienced this pandemic, right? And to me, in my head, the connections between, oh my gosh, we could lose, antibiotics and we're going to have this other pandemic and what we've just been through are very connected. I'm wondering if you are seeing people make that connection and if you are seeing any swell in support for taking this on, or if we still need to get that message out there.
I mean, we saw a really huge rise in, for example, in organic food and interest in purchasing of organic food at grocery stores during the pandemic. So that to me represents that continued swell of support for responsibly raised food. And that really increased in the pandemic. And I think that translates to responsibly raised meat as well. We still have a long way to go, though, in convincing our elected officials that this is an issue of importance. I think the public is on our side. The demand is there. People are looking for transparency. We've heard that as a recurrent theme in this conversation. But when it comes to translating that into political power, I think not yet. And that, for me, speaks to, again, the role of industry that John had let us off with, right? I mean, these companies like McDonald's, like Aramark and Sodexo, all the major food buyers, Costco, Walmart, they control a lot of the supply chain. They have a lot of power to tell their suppliers that they can do better in how meat is raised. And we've seen a lot of shift in the chicken industry. That's fantastic. Now we need to take all of that success and translate it into change in cows, in pigs, and in turkeys, because we know that's where the gaps are.
Right. Well, I am going to let it end there, even though I desperately don't want to, and hand it back over to Danny, who is going to talk with Tiffany Dairy.
Thanks so much, Jane, and to all of the panelists. I want to repeat what Ramanan said earlier. He said it is possible to have an economy of food that doesn't rely on antibiotics. And I think that's something we should keep remembering as we think about this issue in so many ways. And I'm glad we talked about transparency and that Joel was able to talk about, what consumers that he's selling to are telling him, because I think that's a great segue to talk to Chef Tiffany Dairy, who is someone I've admired since seeing her on Top Chef in 2014. I've grown to know her a little bit, and I found that her passion for food goes well beyond taste. She is deeply concerned and a very effective advocate for creating sustainable food systems and equity and social justice. She is the owner of Roots Chicken Shack and Roots Southern Table, which is about to open. Congratulations, Chef. And she's also the founder of Tiffany Dairy Concepts and co-founder of T2D Concepts, and works on countless other projects, which makes me wonder when she sleeps. For her, farm to table is not a trend, but something she thinks of as a way of life. Thanks for joining us, Chef.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
We're thrilled. So as we've heard throughout this discussion, Chef, massive amounts of antibiotics are used on livestock, not people. And chefs have been such a powerful force. They've been powerful advocates on issues like preventing food waste, sustainable farming practices, et cetera. And I'm wondering, how can we make sure that antibiotic resistance gets back on their radar? It was in the early aughts, and how can we make sure they're thinking about it and that antibiotics stay off of their menus?
Yeah, I think we have to first sort of look at big picture in a way. I will be the first to admit, as a chef, as a restaurant owner, that we are faced with 1,000 things right now. We were already talking about, what our profits look like in the beginning, and then, pandemic and how that really affected. Everyone knows the story of restaurants closing and closing. But the truth is that it's important. We're no longer just talking about something that's affecting us. We're talking about something that's going to affect the rest of our generations, our family, countries. It's big picture. It's not about us. And I think as a chef, at some point we have to get down and dirty and take responsibility for what we're doing. A lot of people look to us for answers. I remember when I went to culinary school and I didn't know that being a chef was being an advocate for everything and being responsible for how people eat. And now we have seen that people respond to what we're saying, what we're doing. I remember the time when, we were doing food and we would talk about organic food and, local versus seasonal, and where that line stops and all of those things. But it wasn't until, we put our foot down and said, we're going to buy local. We're going to make sure that it's raised properly. We're going to make sure that it's grown properly, that people started to really take notice. But again, I think consumers have to be educated. There is so much information, and let me say misinformation, out there. It's hard to know what's real, what's not real. We need clear information. And when I think about it in general, of just meat in general, of like organic, pasture raised, antibiotic free, free range. There is so many labels out there, and it sort of reminded me of, I do a lot with food waste. And I remember when we were talking about labels of, use by, sell by, expired, like all of that information that I think consumers just become a little bit confused. So I think that if we can start with clear communication across the board, it would also be better for all of us.
Absolutely, that's fantastic advice, and you are so right that consumers, eaters follow chefs' lead, and so the more that chefs are educated on these issues, the more they understand those labels and what to do with them, the better. But it is a huge responsibility, given everything, Chef Tiffany, that you and so many restaurateurs and chefs have had to take on the last year. But I think it's clear that, like the pandemic, antibiotic resistance affects us all, and it is something that we all need to address. I'm wondering, for you as a chef, what can nonprofits and advocacy organizations like Food Tank and the Natural Resources Defense Council and so many others and the scientists that we've heard from today, how can chefs and restaurateurs and eaters use that information to make better decisions? Because it is a lot to take in, as you mentioned before.
Sure. When we have certain organizations that really sort of do the work, right? Again, chefs have a lot going on. So a lot of times they're not studying, they're not, up on everything. And so when you have organizations that come in and give you information, and sort of wrap their arms around the community, because the chefs, the restaurants take care of the community. It's a lot of time where they go in and they find out about what they should be caring about, how things are happening. We have now this time where consumers really do want to know where their product comes from. But that wasn't the case before. Before it was like, hey, we got fish coming from here. We got, vegetables coming from this farm that was raised this way. We got all of these things. And people in the beginning were like, oh, okay, all right. But that education took place again in the restaurants. I think for us, we need to get information to the chefs. There needs to be some type of hub where information is given, where it is good information. And again, time is critical. One thing we didn't talk on is price, so there is a price that comes with doing things the right way, right? This whole holistic farming approach is really where we need to get to. And I think that when we start to give that information, when they understand, you can't deny it, right? When you know that antibiotics are going in to the animals and that it can affect us as a nation, everyone should be paying attention. And so I think we just need to do a better job of getting that information out.
Well, and organizations like, so many we've heard from today can be a hub for that. They can create those tools that chefs can use and make it easy for both chefs and consumers alike. And education is obviously key. One thing that we didn't talk about is sort of people's palates and the taste of these products. Joel alluded to it a little bit with the quality of the meat and consumers really asking him questions. And I know chefs like you can make anything taste great, but I've also heard chefs talk about how when they source from smaller and medium livestock operations who raise their own animals on grass and pasture and don't use antibiotics, that the chefs believe that those products, whether it's dairy, meat, or eggs, actually taste better.
Tasting is believing. There is power in tasting. There's no denying it. Animals that are raised better taste better. Point blank. Yes. If you're a good chef, you can make anything taste good, but it doesn't mean that it's good for you. And that's what, again, it's more than just putting a good plate of food on a plate. It's about creating a sustainable restaurant. Making sure that we are going back, we know where our food comes from, we know the people who are producing it, we know how they're producing it, and now I can tell that story in my restaurant. And guess what? When that consumer leaves the restaurant, they want to go get that same product. They want to have access to amazing, delicious things that they've had in the restaurant so that they can do it at home.
Absolutely. So, I asked John earlier at the beginning of this, what advice he would give eaters and consumers about this issue. And I'm wondering what advice you give folks, because they're going to restaurants like yours, they're going back to restaurants for the first time in a year and a half. And that's wonderful news. And they have lots of decisions to make about, where they can go. What advice as a chef do you give them?
One of the things that I would do is I would keep putting out the information. We need to talk about it. We have to be really real about what's happening. And at some point, we also need to make sure that through social media, it's ongoing. Through our restaurants, it's ongoing. There's this thing between like a chef and their personal page, right? But for me, I'm the same. I'm the same in the restaurant. I'm going to be the same at home. What I advocate is what I advocate for, and my restaurant stands for that. And I think that we have to be more bold in what we stand for. And let's preach it from the roof, right? From the mountaintop. So let's get out there. Let's talk about this issue. And we have to keep talking about it. So for me, it would be, talking to not only chef friends about it, but also talking to, the people who come in the restaurant and also the people who work with me, so that everyone can be advocates for a better system.
That's such a great point. It's not just the chefs and the cooks, it's the wait staff. It's, again, the consumers. You have to educate everyone. It's a big responsibility, but I love that you want to shout it from the rooftops. And this is definitely an issue that we all need to keep talking about. Thank you so much, Chef. So great to see you.
You too. Thank you.
So Jane, I'd like to invite you back, and we've heard so much today, and some of it very sobering, but I think what came through for me is that there are a number of things that we can do. It's not impossible, as we heard, to shift away from antibiotics. It's not rocket science. For some farmers, it seems, a little bit more difficult, but this is something that we can do. We can make this shift.
Yeah, I was really surprised by that, honestly. I mean, maybe I'm just a glass half empty kind of person, but I was just sort of thinking about this as like, let's put this back on the radar because it's so awful. But then what we heard from our experts was that a lot of the power rests with us, and that feels really good. I think we're all ready to get out and make a difference right now. So yeah. I was surprised and very pleased.
Yeah, I am too. And there is so much hope. And I think, it's clear that we need national and global action on this issue, that we do, as Chef Tiffany said, we need to keep talking about it and preaching from the rooftops. It's not surprising that I think some people might feel disempowered, but there are also, as you just said, people feel like they want to do something now that we're getting back to some sense of the life that we had before. And one way that I want to mention that folks can get involved is to, one, support the organizations that you've heard from today. We have links to their websites on foodtank.com, but there were others that we didn't mention, like the ASPCA, I think Ramadan mentioned the Keep Antibiotics Working Coalition. There's the Food Animal Concerns Trust, the Center for Food Safety, and countless others who are doing incredible work on this. Applegate is also hosting an antibiotics pledge that lets consumers commit themselves to the many small but really, really important ways to fight antibiotic resistance. And that's, again, supporting farmers who raise animals without using antibiotics, and then getting engaged politically. This idea of a citizen eater that, Bob Martin from the Center for a Livable Future and many others have talked about, getting really involved in this and making sure that your local, political leaders, that your national political leaders know about this issue. So those who are interested in the pledge can go to applegate.com/pledge to learn more. Please check it out and sign it if you're so inclined. But I think it's a wonderful way to get involved.
Yeah, I think it's really great. And I just, the other thing I was thinking is just how little, we talked about talking at farmers markets. We should go to the grocery store. You should put something up, go to McDonald's and say, why don't you have antibiotic-free meat? Those are kind of like, I think those things really do go up the chain. And especially on social media, that there's somebody listening and if we all take action, it takes 2 seconds. And what if you made a huge difference?
Absolutely. The power of eaters has never been greater than it is today. So again, get out there and keep talking about these issues. Jane, I want to thank you and all of the panelists and everyone who's been watching and listening today. What a rich and wonderful discussion.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Please stay safe and well.